Attention, attention, this is History Lost in Time. And welcome at episode 38 of the History Lost in Time podcast, the podcast in both English and German. In this episode, I will continue the series about the German broadcasting history. This time I'll talk about Communist East Germany, the GDR, in the early 1950s. The topic of this episode. This episode is the logical continuation of episode 34, in which I talked about radio broadcasting in the Soviet occupation zone from 1945 to 49. When I started writing this episode, it was planned as a single episode. However, it turned out to not have just axis length, but basically axis length times 2. So I'll split this into 2 episodes. One episode dealing with the early 50s before the uprising on June 17, 1953, and one dealing with the early 50s after that uprising. Splitting such a small time frame into 2 episodes is challenging. So in some cases I decided to cross that June 17, 1953 threshold when the content required it. So in this episode there will be some references to the time after 1953, and in the next one there will be some references to the time before 1953. Political agenda and background. None. The sources that were used. Adelheid von Saldern, Inge Marsolek. Zuhören und gehört werden 2, Radio in der DDR der 50er Jahre, zwischen Lenkung und Ablenkung. Translation: Listen and being listened to 2, Radio in the GDR during the 1950s, from controlling to distracting. Published by Verlag Edition Discord, Tübingen, 1998. Bonner Berichte aus Mittel- und Ostdeutschland. Der Rundfunk in der sowjetischen Besatzungszone Deutschlands. Translation: Bonn reports from Central and East Germany. Radio broadcasting in the Soviet occupation zone. Published by Dr. Gerhard Walter and the Federal Ministry of All German Questions, Federal German Publishing Agency, Bonn-Berlin, 1961. Heide Riedel, Hörfunk und Fernsehen in der DDR, ein Projekt des Deutschen Rundfunkmuseums. Translation: Radio and Television Broadcasting in the GDR, a project of the German Broadcasting Museum, published by Literarischer Verlag Helmut Braun, Köln, 1977. On October 7, 1949, the German Democratic Republic, GDR in short, was founded within the Soviet occupation zone. Formally, this was a reaction to the foundation of the West German Federal Republic of Germany, which had already been founded on May 23, 1949. However, in 1946 it started to become clear, and with the Berlin blockade of 1948-49 it was very obvious that the original concept of the 4 victorious powers, Soviet Union, USA, Great Britain and France, to govern Germany together was impossible. The Soviet Union had set up pro-Soviet communist governments in Eastern Europe and posed a serious threat to the democratic nations of Western Europe. Their response to that was the foundation of NATO in 1949. However, the existence of democratic states was a threat for the communist governments in Eastern Europe, which usually had no majority in their populations for their policies. Their reaction was formalizing the military alliance with the Soviet Union, which had existed before already, though, with the foundation of the Warsaw Pact in 1955. Germany was the front line in the conflict between these 2 blocs. Both sides couldn't and didn't want to do without the Germans in this conflict. The original idea to transform Germany into a neutral, demilitarized and deindustrialized state was quickly abandoned by both sides. Relations were normalized quickly, much faster than after World War I, and both German states were integrated into both military alliances. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, a war where communist North Korea faced anti-communist South Korea, so a similar situation with a nation split between the power blocs, the confrontation in Europe heated up as well. Both German states were hostile to each other and considered each other as enemies. This was reflected within radio broadcasting. The hope for a reunification disappeared. Instead, the Cold War confrontation became the central element of the broadcasts. While the Berlin radio station mainly addressed the population of the GDR, the Germany radio station was used as a combat radio station focusing on Western Germany. Just to recap, for the GDR, radio broadcasting was an important pillar of the government. Journalists were not around to report about news in a neutral fashion, but to support and explain party politics. Therefore, journalist training consisted mostly of political training, which had a negative effect on the quality of journalism in the GDR. Many journalists in radio broadcasting were members of the Socialist Party SED or its youth organization, the Free German Youth FDJ. In 1949 and 50, a lot of people were fired from the radio stations, and the programming structure was altered. As these measures happened at the same time, the result was chaos. In her book, Heide Riedel identified 3 phases of radio broadcasting in East Germany between 1945 and 61. The first phase was the time of Soviet occupation from 1945 to 49. From 49 to 52, there was a time of experimentation under German control, and from 52 to 61, the task was to lay the foundation of socialism. Starting in 1952, once Joseph Stalin had given his approval, creating socialism in the GDR was intensified. The GDR leadership tried to copy Soviet methods from the 1920s and 30s and focused mostly on the steel and coal industry, while ignoring the consumer goods industry. This was one of the reasons why the population was dissatisfied. Radio broadcasting was still done using Soviet methods and consisted mostly of political education and confrontation. Happiness and relaxation were basically non-existent and no goals of radio broadcasting. The programs were therefore fairly boring and rejected by many listeners. On page 24, Heide Riedel writes, "The programs lacked appeal. Listeners showed no great interest." And in the book of the Ministry of All German Issues, the following descriptive words are used for GDR radio broadcasting on page 43. Listless, boring, monotonous, self-important, cramped, cheap, and unimaginative. Due to the layoffs and the bad education of the new hires, the result was, as said, chaos. Programs were constantly being cancelled or had to be moved. While today this may not be that annoying to many people, you have to keep in mind that back then people actually prepared themselves to listen to the radio. In the evenings, families gathered around the radio like they later gathered in front of the TV. The cancellation of a large Saturday evening show is comparable to the cancellation of the semifinals of the Soccer World Championship or the semifinals of the Super Bowl. On top of that, programs that were supposed to entertain were constantly interrupted by political insertions. However, the listeners demanded closed evening programs during the prime time from 20 to 22 o'clock. In the Listening and Being Listened to book, it says on page 348, "One did not want a mixed program unless it was expressly announced beforehand, and no interruption of the program by speeches of a political nature." More and more listeners switched to programs from Western radio stations because their unpolitical closed evening programs did exist. In order to prevent this, the GDR started installing jammers in 1952 that were supposed to make receiving Western radio programs impossible. So the GDR used the same method as the Third Reich, and that was actually stated as such by the GDR population and criticized harshly, especially since the GDR first denied the existence of such jammers and only admitted their existence later, a parallel to Russian-Soviet behavior. On page 117 in the book from the Ministry of All German Issues, it says, "The jamming on the Western frequencies was perceived by the population of the zone as an ideological capitulation. In a resolution to the State Broadcasting Committee, the employees of VEB Fernmeldeanlagenbau Dresden, for example, demanded that the jamming be switched off, citing the disrespect that the existence of the jammers indicated and justified their decision. At the Nuremberg Tribunal, German Broadcasting was also accused of having banned the London station from being tapped. This was rightly called undemocratic. But isn't it the same thing to install jammers on West German stations and to punish the tapping under certain circumstances? The population's protests were ignored. The jamming system was even expanded. The jammers added unpleasant whistling and howling sounds on top of the Western radio stations, so receiving them was possible but not really pleasant. Receiving GDR radio stations was tricky enough. Getting all GDR radio stations in good quality at the same time was basically impossible within the GDR. One reason for that was that the GDR leadership focused on improving reception of their programs in West Germany. That created the ironic situation that people could receive GDR programs in the West but didn't want to listen to them, while people in the East wanted to listen to them but couldn't. FM radio towers were also first installed at the border to West Germany, with the transmission direction towards the West. Without a free press and the right to free speech, things that didn't really exist in the GDR, it was difficult for the population to criticize these things. On the other hand, it was difficult for people in the radio stations to find out how people received their programs. Letters from listeners were very important, and here GDR citizens often opened up and shared their honest opinion. The criticism was mostly the same: reception quality, content overlap between the radio stations, repetitions, closed evening programs, and the lack of entertainment programs. In the Listening and Being Listened to book on page 303 it says, "The listeners rarely appeared as submissive supplicants, but rather as demanding ones, as working people who had a right to good reception and good entertainment. We are generally satisfied, but working people like to laugh now and then. And when you are working all day and dealing with serious matters, you'd like to hear something cheerful." Often the population felt like their demands were ignored and that radio programs were not designed for them. In the same book it says on pages 340 and 341, "Until the mid-1950s, the early morning programming of East German radio met with extreme displeasure among listeners. As early as 1950, there were calls for the daily program to begin at 4 a.m. with news, folk music, and above all, time announcements. The vast majority of workers start work at 6 a.m., have to leave home before 5 a.m., and would then like to hear the time again. Listeners found the programming too heavy. It usually makes you want to go back to sleep rather than get up. The main criticisms concerned the music selection, the lack of time announcements, the lack of concentration of the announcers during time announcements, the reading out of long blocks of text, including the editorial from the newspaper Neues Deutschland, and the excessively long hourly news. Obviously, the programming ignored people's everyday routines. The reason for that was the broadcasting strategy of the Socialist Party. On page 180 you can find the following quote. "Until the end of the 1950s, the understanding of the cultural mission of broadcasting did not change significantly. In the task description of the broadcasting program, educational terms such as raising standards, bringing cultural treasures closer, or introducing people to literary or musically valuable works dominated. Light entertainment was not part of that strategy, which is why it barely existed at all. On page 185 you can find this. Cheerfulness, pleasure, or laughter cannot be found in the context of the term entertainment in the official documents of the State Broadcasting Committee, and the word relaxation appears only occasionally." The book From the Ministry of All German Issues says on page 159, "The humorlessness and the brutal seriousness of the entertainment programs often provoked complaints and protest from listeners between 1948 and 55, but it was difficult to remedy the situation. SBZ Radio did not offer entertainment programs solely for the enjoyment of listeners. Every entertainment program was supposed to serve a political purpose. According to the ideas of the State Broadcasting Committee, a new kind of humor was to develop in this process. This affected radio plays in particular. Back then, they were very popular. However, as they also should have a political and educational character, socialist radio plays were produced, which were considered to be boring and therefore rejected." From time to time, the Socialist Party tried to deal with the discontent of the population with controlled criticism. However, at best, this brought some short-term relief, and even controlled criticism could be devastating, like the following one. This was published in the GDR newspaper Sonntag on March 30th, 1952, and can be found on page 42 in the book of the Ministry of All German Issues. Most of the other work programs of the day showed that when creating propaganda, people obviously don't even consider who they are addressing and who and how they can captivate them. The three-headed monster that drives us away from the radio is far too prevalent: schematism, lovelessness, and routine. The daily program is rattled off by basing all programs, whether they are aimed at women, farmers, West Germans, Berliners, or anyone else, on a standard editorial, only seemingly varying it by addressing the same thing first to women, then to farmers, etc. All of this led to GDR citizens realizing that it was pointless to write letters or to voice criticism at all. The amount of letters from listeners dropped significantly. The Gemini radio station received only about 5 letters per month in 1950. Ground zero was reached in 1951, when basically no letters at all were received. Obviously, the people working at the radio stations realized that something had to be changed. However, either they were unable to do so, or, more likely, they were not allowed to. The scope for action for employees at the radio stations was constantly getting smaller, and in the end, the only thing they were allowed to do was to implement the orders from the GDR leadership by the letter. In the Listening and Being Listened to book, it says on page 142, from 1947 onwards, the basic principles of radio broadcasting and its content were entirely determined by the guidelines of the SED party congresses, the Central Committee meetings, and the various cultural conferences. After the founding of the GDR, the German Democratic Broadcasting saw its primary task as anchoring this first workers' and farmers' state on German soil deep in the minds and hearts of its listeners in both German states. As already mentioned, laying the foundation of socialism in the GDR was intensified in 1952. The 5 East German states were abolished and replaced with 14 districts. The East German broadcasting was also restructured. There were now 3 programs with new names: Berlin 1, Berlin 2, and Berlin 3. All 3 programs were centrally managed by the State Broadcasting Committee, which replaced the General Directorate. The last remnants of regional independence were removed, and the entire broadcasting was now centrally organized, just like in the Soviet Union. Berlin 1 took over the job of the Gemini radio station and was primarily targeting West Germany. Berlin 2 was supposed to become the scientific radio station of the GDR, while Berlin 3 was supposed to become the more general station for the masses. Cross-sectional editorial teams supplied programs to all 3 stations, but that led to mixing up and uniformity. The launch of the 3 programs was also a disaster. Quote from the Book of All German Issues, page 68. After just 1 week, complaints to the State Broadcasting Committee began to mount. The Berlin 1, 2, and 3 programs could not be heard everywhere in the zone. Even in Berlin, program 3 could barely be received, and in Dresden, Berlin 1 could not be heard. The new broadcast times for the usual fixed programs were unsatisfactory. In the areas where residents could receive all 3 programs, there was outrage that all 3 stations bore the name Berlin and broadcast the same break signal. Several programs were cancelled every day without any reason given for the change. In other words, it felt more like people received 1 program on 3 frequencies, and in most cases only 1 or 2 of these frequencies could be received properly. The fact that these stations exchanged programs made this impression even worse. In late 1952, some improvements were implemented, but these were mostly superficial. Neither the content nor the style was changed. Unfortunately, it is difficult to properly analyze the content of the time. Back then, the programs were not recorded and stored due to technical limitations, so the only sources we have today are personal memories, reactions and comments in newspapers, and the transcripts of the programs. However, these sources allow some conclusions regarding the entertainment programs, music programs, and the news. On page 121 and 22 in the Book of the Ministry of All German Issues, there are 3 larger sections that describe news and reports of the GDR broadcasting. Within 24 hours, the Soviet Union's endless love of peace had to be mentioned, or examples of the self-sacrificing readiness of the workers, who, under the leadership of the SED, daily strengthened the power of workers and peasants, had to be presented. No news report could be without a message regarding the loss of potency of the enemy camp and on the successful fight of the zone government against saboteurs, agents, and spies. The early fulfillment of plans by state-owned enterprises, additional work by workers, and voluntary commitments to extra shifts were often the subject of top news reports until the popular uprising in the SBZ in 1953. This sounds a bit like news from North Korea today. Now the second quote. The news was selected on the basis that almost only positive news from one's own camp could be processed, while only derogatory reports from Western countries could be processed. If neutral reports from capitalist countries could not be avoided, such as reports from the USA during Khrushchev's visit, they were presented with a positive interpretation for the Soviet Union. Reports that reflected the development or normal life of the Federal Republic of Germany were generally not approved. And the third quote. Major accidents in the Soviet occupation zone with multiple deaths were reported only after prolonged hesitation and with conspicuous brevity. Every piece of news had an ideological significance, and the reluctance to report accidents of any kind was to be understood as a fear of possible ideological consequences. Important unforeseen international events were often reported up to 24 hours later. In addition to the strict censorship and the time required to develop a narrative, the fact that significant reports from Moscow were slow to arrive also had a delaying effect. Here one can draw a comparison to how the Soviet Union handled the Chernobyl catastrophe in the media and in communication with other countries in 1986. News about Western Germany almost always had an aggressive tone. The Federal Republic was portrayed as a totalitarian terrorist state in which citizens were oppressed and mistreated. Classic Russian-Soviet projection was implemented here, the same way as we know it today, accusing the other side of something that one is doing oneself. An example can be found on pages 123-24 that describe the parliament elections of 1953 in a highly distorted way. Under conditions resembling those of 1933, the federal elections were held yesterday in West Germany, with terror, fraud and violence, Adenauer in alliance with American troops, the police and the entire power apparatus prevented a free and democratic decision by the people. Armored vehicles of the riot police and the so-called border guard were on high alert. Large American troop units were concentrated in southern Hesse. To add some color and detail to such reports, the GDR broadcasting usually added reports about election fraud and terrorism of fascist gangs. Voices from the West were limited to disappointed communists and communist newspapers from abroad. Other opinions were not allowed. And obviously there were other things that were not discussed. Quote, page 133. For years, the daily events that were taboo for Soviet zone radio included the escape from the Soviet occupation zone. Only when high-ranking officials, well-known artists or athletes had fled was there reason to issue a brief statement, which, however, was usually broadcast only on Radio GDR, and in which the refugee was often portrayed as a traitor or agent. On pages 200 to 202 of this book, you can find the daily program of both the Berlin radio station and the Germany radio station from September 11, 1951. Both stations provided a full-day program that started at 04:30 in the morning and ended shortly after 0100 at night. The program started with the national anthem at both stations. It is quite striking that both stations brought a lot of word content. There was also music, but it feels like the word-to-music ratio is about 2:1. Also interesting, a broadcasting break from 0915 to 1100 at the Germany radio station and from 0930 to 1115 at the Berlin radio station, at least on medium wave. Now let's take a closer look at the Germany radio station. After all, this one was used as a combat radio station against Western Germany. On page 29 in the book of the Ministry of All German Issues, the GDR radio magazine Der Rundfunk, issue 17 from 1950, is being quoted with the following words. The Germany radio station, which with its winter program of 1949-50 conquered ever larger audiences, especially in the west of our homeland, has become a loyal friend and helper of the working people in their resistance against the destructive fury and war plans of the Anglo-American occupying powers and the German Adenauers and Schumachers. Again, we can find a good example for projection. It is fact that the Soviet Union continued for much longer with dismantling German industrial sites and with that destruction, while the Western powers had already switched to reconstruction with the Marshall Plan by 1948. The accusation of war plans is also projection. When this article was published, the GDR already had a force of 10,000 armed men of the so-called Barracked People's Police, while the West German pendant, the Federal Border Police, was only founded in 1951. As one can see, the GDR press of 1950 had proven itself as a star pupil of Russian-Soviet methods of projection. Always accused the enemy of doing what you are doing yourself. Initially, there were three main programs at the Germany radio station. On page 29 we can find a quote of the Germany radio station describing one of these programs in its own words. The program We Speak for West Germany informs about the cultural decline in West Germany and reports on the struggle of German cultural figures against the attempts of Anglo-American cultural barbarism to undermine them. Obviously, there was a strong cultural influence from America in all of Western Europe. However, there was a similarly strong cultural influence from the Soviet Union in East Germany. On pages 29 and 30, the other programs are described. The program 1/6 of the Earth praised the virtues of the Soviet Union and the people's democracies. In contrast, the series Truth About America aimed to, quote, show the United States as it really is in order to make the listener clear about the aims and intentions of American imperialism. The program was intended to be the counterpart to the Voice of America. Political commentary usually followed quickly after the news. Its goal was to lay down the opinion of the people in the East and to influence the opinion of the people in the West. Commentary was usually very aggressive and made use of lots of colorful insults. On page 128 we can see an example. Political monstrosity, nuclear old man, Bonn nuclear weapons worshippers, nuclear government fraudster. GDR commentator Gessner called NATO General Norstadt a despicable scoundrel. Adenauer and Strauss outlived ridiculous malicious dwarfs. The narrative, which can change daily, prohibits the use of terms like Ministry of Defense of the Federal Republic of Germany or Bundeswehr. Instead, the terms Bonn War Ministry and NATO mercenaries are used. The top commentators were Gessner, von Schnitzler and Eisler. They were able to argue skillfully. However, most of the other commentators were considered to be blunt, wooden and clumsy, and they mostly used the language of functionaries. When it came to longer reports, the GDR broadcasting was often quite awkward. The intention was to collect some statements from civilians when the reporters were out in the fields. However, these statements had to be perfect and needed to fit to the narrative. In the East, the journalists usually asked suggestive yes-no questions that became so obvious that experienced listeners could answer while listening. In the West, the journalists tried to cut together unrelated statements so that they fit their own narrative. And when everything failed, reports were completely made up. An example for that is the report about the Stock & Co. company in West Berlin, where workers were apparently upset because of the bad pay and the production of war materials. However, as it turned out, the Berlin radio station had never actually visited this company. The listeners and so-called interviewed West Germans that could be heard in the Germany radio station were mostly West German communists and their sympathizers. The GDR broadcasting tried to organize listener meetings there as well. However, in 1951, an embarrassing incident took place when a neutral listener asked about the strength of the People's Police and the whereabouts of kidnapped people. The West German Stuttgart radio station had recorded this incident since it had been a public event. That meant that the incident could not be covered up. In order to prevent this from happening again, listener meetings no longer took place. The Germany radio station tried to attack the Federal Republic wherever it could and to portray the situation in the West as catastrophic. When depicting the situation of the workers as similar to those of the late 19th century no longer worked, the station switched over to attacking the profits of large capitalists and attacking the social situation in Western Germany. Every strike was portrayed in such a way as if it was shaking the foundations of the country. The goal was to create the impression that instability and unrest were normal in the West. On page 192, the goal of the Germany radio station is described in an interesting way, and it reminds me of modern-day hybrid attacks from Russia, China, and other nations. Soviet zone broadcasting attempts to incite listeners outside its sphere of influence against their social order through constant ideological aggression. Its interference in the internal affairs of other states goes so far that it encourages residents to change the existing form of government and openly calls for the overthrow of ministers or governments. This activity gave birth to the term broadcasting war on the airwaves. The flip side of these hybrid broadcasting attacks was the program Meeting Point Berlin, which was intended for the GDR population and which Heide Riedel describes on page 42 and 43. The discussions mainly revolved around the political situation in the western zones of Germany, where it was said militarism and fascism were gaining strength again. This program was intended to present the political developments in the Soviet occupation zone in a positive light compared to the events in the Western zones, and to declare that the demarcation from National Socialism had been successfully implemented only in the Soviet-occupied zone. A few finishing words. The early 1950s were difficult years for GDR radio broadcasting. Under the leadership of the SED, it was impossible to create attractive content. The mix of political educational content and entertainment simply did not work. The mix of laying off people, changing the programming structure, and technical difficulties resulted in chaos. On top of that, the own side was described in bright colors, while the enemy in the West was permanently attacked in an aggressive fashion. In the next episode, I will discuss how the uprising of June 17, 1953 influenced GDR radio broadcasting until the mid-1950s. Thank you. This was History Lost in Time.